Good afternoon. My name is Andrew Greene. I'm the Defence Correspondent with the ABC, and today we're having a deep look at the latest ASPI publication on the defence budget, titled The Big Squeeze. So people joining us online will have the opportunity to ask some questions of specific experts here at ASPI. I'll be moderating that discussion, so please start to get your questions in as soon as possible. But to introduce the panel of experts, very well-abled people in a position to talk about various aspects of this document. Joining us today online in various locations around Canberra and the country is firstly Bec Shrimpton, the Director of Defence Strategy and National Security at ASPI. She's joining us from interstate. Jennifer Parker is also online. She is the Deputy Director of Defence at ASPI and with a recent background in the Royal Australian Navy. And finally, David Uren, an economics writer and author, but also a Senior ASPI Fellow. Welcome to all of you. And today we will begin with a summary essentially from David Uren from a macroeconomic point of view. This document has already had quite a bit of publicity. It was released at the time of Senate estimates, so defence officials have already discussed some of the major findings. But if I can begin by handing over to David to take us through some of the key points and his observations.
Well, good afternoon. The last 12 months has been a big period for defence. We've had the announcement of how the AUKUS submarine program is to be incorporated within defence, at least in preliminary terms. We've had the strategic defence strategic review has come out just before the budget with far-reaching recommendations. And so when we received the defence budget, our first instinct is really to look at, well, how does this budget compare with the budget of a year ago? So what has changed? And I guess the first thing that really struck us was that nothing very much had changed, that the totals being provided to defence were really very, very similar to those provided a year ago. Now, each budget provides figures for the current year and then for the next 3 years. So when you're comparing this year's budget with last year's budget, you've got 3 years where you've got an overlap. And when we looked at that overlap, what we could see was that in March last year, which is the final budget of the former government, that it was providing $154 billion for defence funding over the 3 years from 2022, 23, 23, 24 and 25, 26. When we look at the same period in the current budget, it came to $156.5 billion. So it looked like there was a $2.5 billion increase. But when you probe those numbers a little, one of the things that jumped out is that there's quite a big adjustment for foreign exchange. Now, because a large part of the defence budget is purchases of capital equipment, mostly imported from the US and pretty much entirely priced in US dollars. Anytime the Australian dollar goes down, the cost of these capital acquisitions goes up. Similarly, if the Australian dollar goes up, the cost of those capital acquisitions goes down. Now, the government, the Treasury, Finance, they don't, you can't have the defence budget being swung around by swings in the exchange rate. So there's an automatic process of compensating defence for changes in the exchange rate. It's either compensation or else it's if the dollar goes up, defence gets a bit less. So that exchange rate change, if you look from last year's budget through to now, it wound up at about $4 billion. So that's just an automatic compensation for increased costs of defence as a result of a fall in the Australian dollar. The dollar was at about 73 cents 12 months ago. Now it's down to about 65, but at the time of budget was, I think, 67 or so. That was what that was about. Well, you take that out, and where you wind up with is that whereas last year over the 3 years you had 154 billion, now you've got 152.5 billion. So it's a $1.5 billion drop over the 3-year period, basically $500 million a year. Now, in the context of a budget that's $50 billion a year, 1 billion, 500, it's basically a 1% cut. And I guess government departments everywhere are used to efficiency dividends, and generally they're of around that order of magnitude. But this is really coming at a time when defence is having very large new requirements being placed upon it. So this budget includes, for the first time, the first funding for the nuclear-powered submarine program. So there's about $8.9 billion in the been allowed for the first works on the nuclear-powered submarines, of which I think about $6 billion comes from the savings from the cancellation of the French submarine, but that still leaves about $2.9 billion or so to come from defence funding elsewhere. And then there's also the recommendations of the Defence Strategic Review. Now, they come to the initial recommendations have been priced at about $19 billion. Now, quite a number of those programs are already in train in defence. So, for example, I think it's about $3.8 billion. Is that correct, on the hardening of the northern bases?
Rounding's well, actually, that figure.
But of that, I think there's about 3.6 billion is already in the budget, and so it's really only $200 million has got to be found elsewhere. However, there are some programs that have been included as part of this new the response to the DSR. For example, there's a cross-government program for further engagement with the Pacific Islands, Pacific nations. Defence's share of that is about $900 million over the forward estimate period, and that's entirely new money that defence has to find from existing resources. Similarly, there's a promising program to introduce significant retention bonuses to defence personnel reaching the end of their contracts, and that this bonus scheme is costed at about $400 million. Again, that's got to come onto the defence budget. All up, out of the quoted figure of $19 billion, there's about between 7.3 and 7.8 billion is that defence is going to have to find from its own resources. So it's being asked to do more with, one might say, marginally less. However, in fact, as Defence looks at it, if you compare where they're sitting now and where they looked at the budget a year ago, there's another big factor which has hit the budget of Defence, as it has the budgets of every government department and indeed every business and every person in the country, and that's inflation. So the dollar doesn't go nearly as far now as it did a year ago. When you compare the inflation forecasts that Treasury was making in its budget in March last year to the forecasts that it's making now. So March last year, I think it was expecting inflation this year would be about 3.5%, instead of which it's now, well, Treasury in the latest budget says 6%. But if you add up, inflation has a cumulative impact. If you add up the difference between the inflation forecast the Treasury made in its budget last year and the forecasts it makes in its budget this year, the money it falls short by about 5 or 6% every year. In other words, the purchasing power of the defence budget is reduced by about 5 or 6% every year. So you can see there are quite a number of pressures that are building up on the defence budget. You add in the 1% cut after allowing for the foreign exchange. You add in $7-8 billion of unfunded new spending requirements. That's about another 2-3% onto the defence budget. You add in 5 or 6% on the of inflation, and really what you wind up with is a squeeze that amounts to roughly 10%, and that's a lot to try to manage. Now, defence, it is a big department. There's a vast number of moving parts in it. So, yes, it is possible to shuffle things and squeeze things here and squeeze things there. One of the things you'd have to say is that because the Defence Strategic Review came out so shortly before the budget was released, I think the Defence Strategic Review was handed to the Defence Minister and the Secretary of Defence, I think, in February, but I think it didn't get down into the the accounting departments, if you like, the finance areas where this has got to be managed until well into March, so very late in the budget process. So to a certain extent, a lot of the big capital decisions that are going to be made, both on the new programs, how for example the nuclear powered submarine program is to be scheduled, or the missile acquisition is to be scheduled. There are a lot of things that are really just not known, and similarly, there's not much sense at all of where savings are going to be made, what things are going to be cut. So to a certain extent, the budget's in a kind of a holding pattern until these decisions are made. However, what you can see from looking at the defence portfolio budget statement, in some ways it's a bit of a statement of the obvious. It's very hard for Defence to do much about its workforce costs. Defence has actually got a program to lift its workforce numbers, and the costs of the remuneration is set independently. It's not something that Defence can control. Cutting sustainment is always a false economy. You wind up paying more in the long term. So really the only place to cut is really in the capital acquisition program. And indeed, that's what you can see. If you look at the defence portfolio budget statement, there's about a 1.9% cut in the provision for new capital investment, acquisition of new military equipment over the next 3 years relative to the portfolio budget statement of a year ago. Now, to us, just looking at that, cutting your capital spending just doesn't seem to be consistent with what we're hearing about the growing geopolitical complexity of the world, the strategic imperatives that are calling for a repositioning of defence, a refocusing of defence, an intensification, if you like, of defence equipment and preparedness and readiness. We no longer have the luxury of the 10-year window to prepare for any conflict. We need to have a much greater degree of readiness. And instead, we seem to be going backwards. So it looks to us like that's a bit of a problem over the next 4 years. Now, the budget does include a provision from 2027-28 onwards through to 2032-33. Over a 6-year period, there's an additional $30.5 billion being included in a contingency fund to support enlarged defence spending over that longer term period, which is it's really out the medium term. So that over at the latter end of the decade, you'll start to see Australia's level of defence spending rising from about 2.0% at the moment up to about 2.3% by then, and that will be good. But I guess there's a question as to whether that's really a bit too late to leave it, and whether we really need to be acting with a bit more urgency now.
And on that point, David, I think that we can probably bring in Bec Shrimpton on this suggestion that David and others have made, that in real terms there's this cut at a time when more is being asked of defence. First of all, Bec, where do you think we might see the Defence Department trying to make some savings? And on the other hand, isn't Defence this huge beast of a department where there is always spare amounts of, huge amounts of cash lying around in contingency funds, as David has just pointed out to one there?
Thank you, Andrew. Well, where Defence will look to make savings initially, and in this first ask, will be, frankly, to look at the IAP and look where savings can most easily be harvested. And that is going to be in and around things that can be put off without risk to the safety of the ADF or risk to capability as much as possible. So you're going to start to see things, you're playing around the edges of estate and infrastructure, for example, and just putting things off. Can you hear me? That looks like I just did. Okay, apologies. Now that actually just kicks the can down the road, even on issues of infrastructure. And again, when you're talking about the complexity of defence and the challenges and the pressures that it's facing, they're not just financial. Workforce retention and recruitment is a real issue. So you have to think about your what impact what you're doing now, even on those things that look easy, and it looks like there's money to be pulled quite readily. What impact is that going to have on some of your broader strategies that are really going to talk to genuine capability? And you're absolutely right. The perception that defence is enormous and almost over-resourced is an easy one to walk away with until you've been in contact with that organisation yourself and you understand how it works. It's a deeply complex enterprise. It manages an enormous workforce, a range of facilities, really interesting capabilities, some of which date back 40 and 50 years, some of which are using technologies that is just being created now. You're trying to integrate these for an effect and do that as efficiently as you possibly can, as safely as you possibly can, and first and foremost, always thinking and putting people first. In a democracy and in a voluntary professional military like ours, you really have to have people front and centre. So it's not an easy ask. I wouldn't want to be one of the folks in defence faced with this job right now, although it is probably one of the most important jobs in the country. So look, they've got a hard job ahead of them. There is not the flexibility within the system that people think there is. There is a lot of committed money. A lot of that contingency money is there for very good reason. Most of it is often used. A lot of people say, oh, but defence is sitting on an underspend, and sometimes defence doesn't have the capability to spend the money. Well, again, that talks to the complexity of the enterprise and to many of the issues that have to be got at to implement this DSR in the way that the government wants it done. And you're going to have to look at reform of acquisition process, of the whole life of the capability cycle. You have to look at fast, rapid prototyping and technology, and where technology can achieve efficiencies, again, without compromising safety. So, I would just say it's a deeply, deeply complex endeavour. And it's not as easy as it looks.
Well, Bec, on that note, I'll remind people watching that we are taking questions, and we'll get to one of those questions shortly. I did hear you use the word efficiency, which I don't often hear used by people talking about defence. Maybe that's an unfair criticism, but I'll bring in Jen Parker to this conversation as well. Jen, particularly on this idea of contingency, perhaps you have some thoughts there, and after we hear from you, we'll start to get into the first of our questions from the audience.
Yeah, look, thanks, Andrew, and thanks, David and Bec. The contingency is an interesting one. I think people misunderstand it. The DSR does talk about the fact that in the integrated investment program, which is only a subset, so it's the acquisition sustainment subset of the defence budget, defence generally aims to carry about 20% of over-programming. At the moment, the DSR talks about the numbers being 24%, and what that means is in year, defence, the cost of acquisition sustainment now, when you don't even take into account the DSR requirements, you don't even take into account the AUKUS submarine requirements, is carrying that risk. They've basically acquitted or committed to 24% more funds in each year than they actually have. And that's before we start squeezing in the additional stuff. The contingency element too, look, every acquisition line does have an element of contingency in it. It's generally about 5 to 10%. I know people raised eyebrows when there was some reporting that the contingency around the AUKUS submarines of $368 billion over 30 years was 50%. That's there to account for risk. Look, there's often a lot of criticism at defence in the acquisition space, and I know the ANAO audit on Hunter is quite revealing. But that is, I would say, by exception, not the rule. Defence manages many capability projects, and they're not all like that. But there is a point there that acquisition of complex military equipment, it is hard to predict how much that's going to cost. That's not a get out of jail for, Hunter going from 30 billion to 45 billion upwards, but it is complex trying to understand how new and emerging technologies are going to change these capabilities. So I think that the commentary around, well, actually defence is carrying a lot of fat in their budget and they can easily accommodate this, I think that would be nice. It would be wonderful for Australia if that was the case and we could squeeze this all in. But I think it's actually really challenging. And if we want to get after the acceleration that the DSR talks about we need to based on strategic situation, there is a real issue of that needs to be funded at some point.
Okay, well put, Jen. You raised some some pertinent issues there, but I still think a lot of people were very surprised at that contingency figure in the AUKUS submarine. I don't think we've seen something ever that high in any defence project. But to the first of our questions, and I'll quote from it directly, what does the panel make out of the concerns raised by Peter Dean and others, one of the report authors of the DSR, that Defence doesn't have the capability to spend more money right now? I think we've started to address this, but do you think that Defence could see a big cash injection in 12 months after the National Defence Strategy and some of the internal reforms are completed? Throw it open to anyone who wants to take that.
Well, I'll just say that we've had some discussion about contingency. There are different contingency funds. The federal government budget has a contingency fund for decisions made but not yet announced. It's not a hollow log. It's simply it's not somewhere for salting away money that for undefined purposes. It's got quite strict rules around it. What we know is that there is this funding for defence from beyond the forward estimate period from 27, 28 onwards. But what also we know certainly is that there is no money in that contingency fund for 12 months out. So each year's expenditure review committee starts essentially with a blank sheet. They can make decisions. They could make a decision, over the next 12 months that in the wake of the National Defence Strategy that there needs to be a significant increase in funding. That is possible, but what you can say is that it's not in the planning at the moment. As to whether it has the capability of spending the money, there are issues there, but I think that one of the recommendations of the strategic review is that our strategy should lead to capability, which should lead budget decisions. That you've got to sort of sort out what your capabilities are, what they need to be, and you've got to move towards them, and that's got to shape your approach to budgeting. The problem that Defence faces with this kind of intense squeeze on its resources is that it's having to sort of cut things on this side, and it's having to do so much shuffling and movement and scrimping here and pairing there when those decisions might not be strategically driven. They're being cost driven. That what you wind up with is greater inefficiency and just not good quality spending, across the breadth of it. So, I think yes, Defence has at times had trouble spending its budget, and that may continue to be the case. But you've got to plan for the acquisition of the capabilities and budget accordingly.
I'll get Jen to jump in briefly here, and then we'll move to the next topic that's been raised by our audience.
Thanks, David and Andrew. Look, I think one of the things we talk about in the report, The Big Squeeze, is that we hope that really this budget is a holding budget. So David mentioned there is more money in 26, 27. We've advocated in the report that potentially that needs to come forward a couple of years. Realistically, the $19 billion in forward estimates of investment that's talked about post-DSR, that's kind of DSR tranche one. I think the next 12 months, both Defence and the government are really going to understand what the DSR proposed strategy outlines, what that means for the National Defence Strategy, and what that means for capability acquisition. So I suspect in the next budget, and hopefully the National Defence Strategy will drop before the budget, we will see significant changes that really reflect what a focused integrated force means. Does that mean money will come earlier? Not sure, but I think we will see changes in the next 12 months.
Thank you, Jen Parker. Next question. In a budget-constrained environment and an increasing focus on schedule and speed, will Australian industry content or even commitments to build here in country or invest in country be sidelined? And how will the government balance this? Perhaps get some thoughts from Bec Shrimpton.
Sure, happy to kick this one off. Look, this is an observation I think that has been felt across industry and a concern that has set in with industry players, particularly Australian industry players. But equally, those established multinationals who very much bring Australian small and medium enterprises into the supply chain and rely upon them, which is something that government and defence has actively encouraged to assist the growth and the development of the Australian defence industry. What does this budget mean? Now, the key trends that we have noted in and for defence industry and the Australian defence industry is an increasing share of that sustainment budget, but not so much the acquisition. So defence is still buying a lot of kit from overseas, and you are going to see an increase in pressure perhaps to do more of that because they are proven, ready, demonstrated capabilities that exist that may not be there in the industry. Now, you will get Australian industry players, and some of them quite rightly saying, but hang on, there is good capability here, and defence and government are just not buying it. We're being forced to sell overseas before, and prove ourselves before we buy our own kit. There is some truth to that claim, and I think the industry policy review will be looking at this issue very hard and seeking to achieve balance. Ultimately, what we want in this country is an industry base that does feature some really big, capable multinationals that can pull in important high-end capability quickly. But we want a nice, what defence would describe as fattening the middle. We've got really niche, excellent, world-leading in some cases capability, but it's very small. It's small in scale. So what they're trying to do, and have been for years, is fatten the middle of that sort of industry spectrum that we see in this country, because it's anemic. It's a little bit, it's lacking in that middle. Now, we will have to think hard about how we do that. You're going to have to look at levers beyond just industrial and acquisition strategies to get at it. You have to look at investment in technologies. You have to look at investment in workforce. Again, these are complex issues that have interdependencies with other policy areas, as well as other lines of spending and activity within defence. So really looking out for that defence industry policy review. I do think we're going to see a move away from that really strong commitment to Australian sovereignty. We're going to look to see defence define what sovereign means far more clearly, define what really matters to have and control here, and look at this concept that's emerging globally of friendshoring, partnering, etc., to answer some of those other questions about how we get to capability.
And Bec, I think the definition is already being made with AUKUS. We're seeing an inherent bias towards the Anglosphere. When there is niche capabilities in Australia, we're often just importing them anyway from either the United States or the United Kingdom, while ignoring our own region or other players a little further beyond. But I'll move on to our next question, which has come in, and it is, quote, how can Australia realistically address the capability gap and develop sustainable sovereign capability in defence with such a squeeze on resources? So a follow on to what we've just been discussing. Perhaps I'll turn to either David or Jen on this one.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think it will come with costs. I think trying to achieve what the DSR is recommending without additional material resources. I think you'll see costs in essentially wasted funds on existing programs that'll wind up being subscale, sub-economic, with severance costs. I think, I think one of the key issues is this concept that we have to have greater readiness. So there's some urgency and some speed that's required in responding to both this and to the Defence Strategic Update of 2020. There've been pressures for greater urgency and resolve in the decision making. So I think it's not easy to see how you can do that within a fixed envelope. It would be better to try to say, well, look, we're moving things in this direction, and this is what it's going to cost. What are we going to cut to make way for it? But somehow you've got to take a sense of what those capability requirements are first. That should be what drives your decision. And I don't really get the sense that that's what's happening. I mean, I think one thing that, my sense of, how come the government put out a budget like this? Well, I think the government still saw that defence funding was increasing year by year. It's not every government department's getting that kind of annual increase. They can manage, whereas what's being demanded of defence is something a great deal more, and I just think it's going to cause problems.
In fact, there's a lot of price pressures on all areas of government, so perhaps it's not at all surprising that a new government, left of centre, with a whole lot of promises already made, would have to look for savings, and defence, given its record on some projects, would be a totally understandable target. I will go, though, to Jen briefly in response to this topic, and then we'll move on to our next question.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Look, it's an incredibly interesting topic. The DSR alludes to it a little bit when it talks about we will need to consider some commercial off-the-shelf acquisition, and some of that may not be from Australia. But I think really it comes down to we need to identify as a country what our sovereign priorities are for defence capabilities. I think Bec talked to this a little bit before, and understand that and then focus on those areas. And I think AUKUS Pillar 2, there's not a lot about AUKUS Pillar 2, and I think there's a question in there about that. But hopefully that allows the opportunity, at least with the UK and the US, to identify where Australia is world leading and promote that, and potentially, obviously, leverage off the US and UK in areas that we're not world leading. So I think that will be a really interesting development in terms of where our sovereign capability priorities are and how we can potentially export some of those capabilities to those two countries.
Now, two of our questioners have picked up on this topic of AUKUS Pillar 2, so I'll try to combine the questions. Given the budget constraints, how can we realistically prepare for the ramp-up of AUKUS spending later this decade? Has the government adequately explained the opportunity cost within AUKUS? I'll probably turn to Bec Shrimpton on this one. And also, given it's now 2 years since AUKUS was unveiled, is there anything that's been developed or procured under this Pillar 2, and if so, what is it?
Yes, thank you very much. Look, Pillar 2 is the one that we're going to see quicker results under, and in fact we have had a trial demonstration of artificial and autonomy. This happened in the UK in late April, and did demonstrate the three nations working together to test. Now, I think these were probably sort of existing trials or capabilities within one of the countries, but this is how they've been brought together, and they did demonstrate that they're effectively able to achieve an effect. So there's some progress on the board for AUKUS Pillar 2, but this is where we want to see a lot of activity, and a lot of activity quickly. Again, this is where we are suffering, I think, from a lack of clarity and definition of what the priorities, the priority technologies are, and the priority capabilities are that we want to see addressed under AUKUS Pillar 2. So hopefully we'll see a little bit more on that, although again, this is getting into very sensitive areas quite quickly. So we will have to accept that there will be a certain amount of activity that we don't see in the public. Now, when you talk about the AUKUS writ large, so Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, and the ramp up over time, I don't think we've quite brought the public along with understanding the need for AUKUS. And again, it does depend which particular pillar you're talking about. But if we just combine them all and say the AUKUS deal and the collaboration between the UK, the US and Australia, and the big why of that, and why it needs so much money and why it needs to start happening now, I do think there's a line of effort that needs to come from government and defence to really help people understand why we need to spend this amount of money, and why we need to go after these kinds of capabilities in this way. And the other thing that we have to do is address concerns of our region. Andrew, you raised this before. There are not only, there's not only a desire to be involved, but there are some concerns over what this means. So that tells us automatically that we do have a lot more talking to do. This is a government that has committed to doing that, but we also have to find ways to bring the region in. And it's AUKUS Pillar 2 that will enable us to do that with key regional partners like Japan, South Korea, India, Indonesia, ASEAN. I mean, there are ways that we can do this. So I think that's the opportunity. I really hope we start to see a lot more conversation on this with the public, and I'm sure we'll see it with the region soon.
Now, we only have 5 minutes remaining, so I'll try to get to one last question. And again, to quote directly, do we know how defence planning to understand sovereign, AUKUS, Quad and global industry innovations and capabilities, bit of a typo here, but that a defence could, do we know when defence could start making decisions on that? Throw very briefly to anyone who wants to pick that up before we wrap the discussion.
I think Bec touched on it before. It'll be interesting to see what comes out in the Defence Industry Policy Review. I suspect they'll need to put out some clear definitions in there about what we understand to be our sovereign priorities beyond obviously the SIGPs which are produced. And I would say what that acronym stands for, but I cannot remember. So I think that we will see some more definition. Is there the opportunity for defence to start getting up to some of those things now? Look, likely they probably are. There is a lot of mystery around AUKUS Pillar 2, probably for good reason, but I suspect defence is already pursuing a number of those areas. I will just give a plug. If you are interested in some of the capabilities that might sit under AUKUS Pillar 2, ASPI has just released an update to our tech tracker, which talks about some of the capabilities that might be key to some of those 6 themes in AUKUS Pillar 2. And I suspect defence is likely looking to get after some of those.
Does anyone want to jump in briefly before we wrap the discussion? Yeah, Bec.
I might just add one thing here as we think about this. We've got a lot of reviews coming this year. The DSR has established the need for a net assessment process. That is really important. So we talked before about sequencing. You do need to have a good, strong, robust assessment of your environment. Then you have a strategy. You think about capabilities. So strategy drives capabilities, as we've said in the report, and capability drives budget. But ultimately, a good strategy is about aligning those things and making sure that they are in fact in alignment. Now, noting that the net assessment process should probably be up and running to inform the National Defence Strategy that will be delivered before the next budget. But will we be in a situation like we are this year where we have an entirely big new defence strategy drop right before a budget, and therefore a budget that can't respond in time? Interesting. How does defence and government manage this? There are probably ways to do it. That strategy should be tasked with identifying early opportunities to get after AUKUS Pillar 2 technologies and key capabilities, sovereign, regionally relevant, hitting all of those key policy objectives that we have. I think they need to be there, ready to go, and I do think there's a case to be made for bringing that contingency funding and some of that spend forward.
And on that point, I'll thank the panel who've joined me today to discuss this ASPI publication, having a deep dive look at the defence budget from 2023 to 24, the big squeeze. Some great questions that came in from the audience. Great discussion from the panel. Firstly, to thank David Uren, an economics writer and a senior ASPI Fellow who joined us today from Interstate. Bec Shrimpton, the Director of Defence Strategy and National Security at ASPI. And finally, to Jen Parker, also here at ASPI, the Deputy Director of Defence, and with a specific focus on capability. Thank you once again to the audience for submitting your questions. And from me, Andrew Greene, the ABC Defence Correspondent, thank you all for joining us. Thanks a lot.